Hey, and welcome to the Jack's Top 10. Today we have a video that will shake you to the core. Picture the scene. You're at a funeral, or are in the process of arranging one, when the person who's supposed to be in the coffin turns up to see what's going on. That's stuff of imagination, you might say. More often than not, you'll be right, but sometimes it really does happen. So let's take a look at 10 such instances when it did happen. Hold on to your hats because this might get a bit spooky. Nicephorus Glykos was a bishop working in Lesbos, Greece, when he was declared dead on 3rd of March 1896. In accordance with tradition, his body was left on display in the Methymene church. It was on the second night of what was known as the exposition of the corpse that things took a turn. For Glykos sat up, reportedly demanding to know what all the fuss was about. Turned out, he'd just been having a long nap. The story of Noela Rukundu made headlines around the world in 2016. A resident of Australia, she had returned home to Burundi to attend the funeral of her stepmother. Unbeknownst to her, her husband had arranged hitmen to take her life while she was there, and they duly grabbed her. However, these were hitmen with a heart. When they realized her own husband had ordered her killed, they gave Rukundu her freedom. She soon flew home, approaching her husband at her own funeral to confront him about his plan. Man, that must have been rough. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison at the end of 2015. And dare I say, he deserved it. Chang De-yang was 66 years old when he decided to stage his own funeral. He arranged it himself, wondering how many would turn up given that he had never married and had no children. There was a particular reason for his concern. In Chinese culture, the dead are said to have needs, and their graves are supposed to be visited regularly to ensure those needs are met. In the event, 40 invitees turned up at De-yang's funeral along with several hundred others. Yet, he wasn't happy. 20 relatives and friends didn't show up. "I cannot believe so many relatives and friends don't care about me," he was quoted as saying. Now there's more than one example of someone who arranged their own funeral just to see who would turn up. In 1997, Serbian pensioner Vuk Peric posted a fake death notice in his local newspaper and sent invites to his funeral. He then watched the event from a distance, eventually emerging to reveal that he was indeed alive. He thanked the mourners for attending though. 78-year-old Walter Williams of Mississippi was pronounced dead on 26th of February 2014. As CNN reported, the correct paperwork was completed. His body was put into a body bag and he was taken to a funeral home. Yet, Williams didn't make it to his funeral because when his body was taken to the embalming room, his legs began to move. Then, the coroner noticed him lightly breathing. Williams was alive. It was, as it turned out, a short-lived reprieve. Just over 2 weeks later, he passed away for real. The village of Browing in Hertfordshire, England, celebrates Old Man's Day on 2nd of October each year. The tradition dates back to 1571 and the funeral of a local farmer by the name of Matthew Wall. On the way to his funeral though, one of his pallbearers dropped his coffin. It's a good thing he did because the jolt promptly woke Wall up. The farmer would live for over 2 decades more, finally passing away in 1595. His coming back to life continues to be cause for celebration in Browing. Gilberto Araujo of Brazil was pronounced dead back in 2012 after his body had been identified at the local morgue by his brother. Family members of the 41-year-old were standing alongside his coffin in mourning when Araujo turned up at the door. The untimely funeral was a case of mistaken identity. Araujo worked as a car washer in the town of Alagoinhas, Brazil, where there had been a murder. That murder took the life of another car washer who apparently looked like Araujo, hence his brother's confusion. We can only imagine the two weren't very close. When Fazilio Muhammad Zainov of Kazan in Russia collapsed at home following a heart attack in 2011, she was quickly rushed to her local hospital. But the journey was apparently in vain. She was soon declared dead. This story that follows, though, has both good and bad sides to it. The good part, she was alive. A few days later, as she was laying in her coffin at her own funeral, she woke up. She saw the mourners around her crying and praying for her, and quickly twigged to what was happening. She reportedly and understandably began yelling and was quickly rushed back to hospital. However, the shock of what had happened took its toll. She just lived for an additional 12 minutes in intensive care prior to dying once more, this time permanently. Heart failure was ultimately registered as the cause of her death. 28-year-old Hamdi Hafiz al-Nubi worked as a waiter in Luxor, Egypt back in 2012. It was while he was working one day that he had a heart attack and apparently perished. He was declared dead, and his family took the body home, washed it according to Islamic traditions, and readied it for his burial at the end of the week. The fact that al-Nubi was actually alive was spotted by the doctor sent to sign the final death certificate. He took a closer look at the body when he noticed it was still warm and discovered that al-Nubi was still breathing. He quickly alerted the man's mother, and what was said to be his funeral turned into a celebration instead. When an airstrike by the Assad regime killed over 100 people near Damascus, Syria in 2016, one of the casualties was seemingly Muhammad Rayhan. He had been at the local market, which took the force of the blast, and was apparently dead, buried under rubble. That turned out to be only half true. Rayhan's family and friends organized his funeral, which went ahead a few days later without the corpse. But said friends and family got a very pleasant shock when the man himself turned up at it. Apparently, Rayhan had been buried under the rubble following the explosion for 36 hours, but he eventually managed to free himself. When he arrived at his funeral, he was still covered in the remnants of the rubble in his hair and beard. And as they say in the Middle East, when it's not your time, no one can take you away. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so you get notified whenever we upload our next video. Your valuable suggestions are very important to us, so do post them in the comment section.